Rick, I just wanted to thank you for being here with all of us today. It's not only great coffee, but great company as well.
Well, you're very kind. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with all of you. After all, you're the future of public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy. I've had a fascinating career, and I'm delighted to tell you and share with you some of my conclusions from my time in the diplomatic service. But I'm really most excited to be here with you because you're the ones about to launch into the world.
So Rick, during our time as interns in Cultural Programs Division at ECA, we've seen how cultural diplomacy can support U.S. foreign policy while helping others around the world learn more about life in the United States. You have had a storied life in cultural diplomacy spanning over 4 decades in both the civil and foreign service, I might add. What is your earliest memory of participating in cultural diplomacy?
Well, it's interesting that my earliest memory goes back to the chilly days of the Cold War, back to the mid-1970s, when I worked on a traveling exhibit about life in America in the former Soviet Union. It turned out that Uncle Sam was very interested in young people. I was in my 20s at that point who spoke Russian. And so we went to the Soviet Union, and I had the good fortune or the misfortune, depending on how you look at it, of being the very first exhibit guide, the very first American that visitors would come to when they opened the doors of the exhibit hall. And thousands of Soviet visitors poured through the exhibit. And when they first came to me, they began rapid firing these questions about negative aspects of the United States. What about crime in America? What about racism? What about drugs? What about Vietnam? What about Watergate? And my first thought internally was, oh boy, this is going to be a long day and a long exhibit. But it turned out that they weren't trying to be difficult. They weren't trying to embarrass or shame me about or us about the United States. But the issue was they didn't have a lot of time, and they felt a sense of urgency because they really wanted to understand about our country and their country and our relationship. And all they heard about from their own government was propaganda about how terrible American society was. And yet at the same time, they got the contradictory message that America was the richest country, the greatest superpower, the most economically, scientifically advanced country. So how were they supposed to square these two things? They would even say, I've never met an American before, certainly not one that speaks Russian. I may never meet another American again. So how can you help me understand what America is really like? And it was a valuable first introduction to cultural diplomacy and the importance of human relationships because it combined both an initially negative impression with what turned out to be actually a positive, substantive chance for communication.
Why does the State Department have an office dedicated to cultural programs?
It's because of the importance of the human dimension, whether that is between individuals, between groups, communities, even countries in some cases. We often make things too complicated and we sort of overlook the obvious. If you want to make progress in a relationship, if you want to have a productive, successful cooperation with another group, another country, then you need to have a broad relationship with that person. And nothing achieves that kind of relationship on a quicker level than the arts and culture.
Cultural diplomacy is also a gateway through which we can reach broader audiences, such as those underserved, hard-to-reach areas, and places where people might not have ever met an American.
Gateway is a term we really like, idea. Thank you. We talk about it because, again, as I said earlier, we're the U.S. Department of State, and we don't do art for art's sake. We do it for a larger purpose to make America safe and prosperous and secure in the world, and to reach out to other communities and other countries. And in order to reach those vital audiences, we have to offer them something that they want. But if you send someone in the arts, in dance, in music, then you attract them, then they're interested. You've got a mutual understanding there. And then you take the opportunity, once the audience is there, once the audience is engaged, to talk about other values, whether that's inclusion, peaceful resolution of conflict, rights for women and girls, or even something as complicated as nuclear non-proliferation, where the actors who are negotiating these agreements and difficulties need to have a greater understanding of each other as human beings and a larger relationship to work in. And that's why we pay so much attention to arts and culture in our programming. But let me ask a question. Why do you think it's important to reach out to young people with cultural programming?
I think when young people participate in something that has the power to shift their perspective or see the world in a new way, they take those ideas back with them to their home communities and may even be inspired to start their own initiatives. I recently interviewed Mohammed Al-Wahabi, who is an alumnus of one of our programs. In 2015, he participated in Between the Lines, which is a creative writing summer program at the University of Iowa. This experience was really inspiring for him because for the first time, he was among a community of people who were passionate about the same thing he was passionate about. And so that inspired him to go back home to Casablanca and start his own creative writing program called the Olive Writers. And when I think about the impact that the Olive Writers has on Moroccan writers today, and how that might even inspire them to go back to their hometowns in Morocco and start their own initiatives, I see this immense chain of impact that starts with our cultural programs and branches off well beyond our alumni.
You know, Rick, I have a question. Cultural diplomacy creates an opportunity for the exchange of ideas and opening for conversation. In your experience, is there an artist or a program that stands out to you?
I have to say they're all successful in doing this because that's the nature of cultural and artistic exchanges, that they have this kind of beneficial effect. We long ago abandoned the model of sending American artists abroad to perform on a stage for an audience and then go back to their hotel rooms. We don't do that anymore. We want the artists in the community. So we send them to schools, youth centers, community centers, and do collaborative projects. And when all parties are invested in this kind of new creative production, that's when you get the most powerful effect.
Cultural diplomacy can support policy objectives and priorities. So how do we make something like diversity and inclusion come alive through culture?
Sonny, actually, I have to confess, it's the easiest thing in the world. Because if you take a broad, inclusive definition of culture, you automatically bring in diversity. For example, the United States. If you're talking about Tejano fusion and you're talking about Black contributions to American culture, and then you're looking at Appalachian bluegrass and clog dancers, just if you look at the diversity of American culture, you automatically bring in all these different angles. So it's actually, if one is broad-minded about it and inclusive, you automatically bring in that marvelous diversity.
So just as a follow-up, how do we tell other countries what to do when we're still working on it ourselves?
One of the beauties, one of the secret geniuses, if you will, of cultural programming and all of educational exchange programming is that we don't tell, we don't dictate, we don't preach, we share. We show them who we are, they show us who they are. When visitors come to the United States, they see with their own eyes, they hear with their own ears, they ask questions with their own voices, and they make up their own minds. And because they come to these conclusions themselves, they're lasting. And when we send Americans abroad, there's no party line, to borrow a term from the Cold War days. They go as themselves, as individuals and as artists, and they say what they think, and they explain their vision of culture, and they come together that way.
Rick, Secretary Blinken has highlighted U.S. foreign policy for all Americans. What does that mean for artists traveling abroad through cultural programs?
That's a great question, Mimi. Arts programming is perfect for individuals, for groups to travel anywhere in the world, because when it comes to art, there's such an immediacy, there's such a commonality that artists share around the world. They don't have titles, they're not CEOs, they don't have degrees, doctor this or that. They're the artists, and they recognize and they appreciate other people who share their artistic desire, their passion, their craft. So singing, dancing, playing instruments, they operate on a basis of mutual respect and mutual appreciation of the arts. And so we can send our American artists anywhere in the world and bring foreign artists to anywhere in the United States, and they will find individuals with whom they can quickly make an immediate connection. But let me go ahead and ask my next question now of all of you, and that is, you've all become interns in the cultural division of the State Department. So what is your connection with the arts and culture?
I know that my most powerful learning experiences have never been found in a book, but they've been found in this telling to and listening of stories. And now, because of the pandemic, these stories have been translated onto the screen and they're reaching wider audiences, and in that, they're building a deeper, more meaningful cultural understanding.
I worked with American Voices on their American Music Abroad program, which sends US bands and artists overseas to foster cross-cultural communication and people-to-people connection around the world. I worked with a team of interns to bolster diversity and inclusion through targeted applicant recruitment in underrepresented groups. There were 100 more women that applied this year than last year. All but 4 states were represented. 18 Indigenous artists applied, up from 9. It was such a fulfilling experience for all of us and really showed us how important music and diversity are in shaping the story of America.
So tell me, Sensarie, what's new in cultural diplomacy?
That's a really great question, Rick. I would say that Arts Envoy is one of the most impactful programs we have. In fact, in the arena of culinary diplomacy, we're really making waves there. So for example, there was a program with Embassy Jerusalem where 3 different chefs came together in the Middle East to celebrate Ramadan, Easter, and Passover. And so it's just really beautiful to see culinary diplomacy bring people together as a means of resolution, as a means of exchange, as a means of mutual understanding. So I love it.
So Rick, it's been great to speak with you and have a cup of coffee together. I've loved hearing about your experiences, but also it's been awesome to have the opportunity to share our own experiences with you. And that kind of leads me to the closing question, which is the impact of cultural diplomacy. Looking forward, how do we keep cultural diplomacy relevant?
Well, you know, Ryan, the single most important thing, again, may sound very obvious, the single most important thing about keeping cultural policy powerful and relevant is to simply remember how important it is. Remember the impact that it has, and always be sure that in our foreign policy, in our international engagement, we always include culture and the arts. Because American popular culture is the most pervasive, influential popular culture in the world, whether you like that or dislike that. The fact remains. And so if you're a foreign policy expert and you're surveying the world and trying to decide where America's natural advantages are, where our competitive strengths are vis-a-vis our rivals, if you will, but also how to work best with our allies, then you want to remember that everybody in the world knows who Beyonce is. Everybody in the world wants to see Black Panther or Star Wars, and so forth and so on. American popular culture is an important presence in the world, and when we craft our foreign policy and craft our messages, we need to keep that in mind so that we use the taxpayers' precious dollars to supplement that, to complement that, and make our leadership stronger overall. Another thing I want to add in, and that is, this may sound strange, but 10,000 minnows don't make a whale. And what I mean by that is that all of the private sector contacts around the world, you might say, well, that's enough. Why bother the government or the taxpayer at all if the private sector is doing so much? It's because the private sector doesn't go where we need to go with a coherent strategy. It follows what it should follow. It should follow profit and popularity. But we need to go to certain countries. We need to reach certain audiences with specific messages. And only the U.S. government and the American people can do that.